When I turned 74, I really believed I had raised a good man, but one morning, everything fell apart. I logged into my bank account, and every dollar I'd saved was gone. I asked my son about the money I needed for my medicine, and he just said, "Your health isn't my problem." In that moment, something inside me broke. He thought I'd cry, but instead, I sat there quietly and rewrote my will. I promised myself he'd regret what he'd done. Most mornings were always the same. For me, I'd eat my warm, tasteless oatmeal, swallow my red pill for blood pressure and the blue one for my cholesterol, and watch the local news for an hour before checking my email. But that day, nothing was normal. The second I opened my banking app, my heart jumped. I blinked hard, thinking maybe it was a mistake. The account where I'd put every birthday check, every bit of extra pay from my nursing shifts, every refund and coin I'd ever saved for my retirement didn't just say zero. It was overdrawn by $72. I stared at the screen like it was a nightmare. I refreshed the page, but nothing changed. When I looked at the transaction history, I saw it right there. One giant withdrawal, $312,473. All of it gone in one sweep. My hands were shaking as I called the bank. After going through those endless robot menus and terrible hold music, a woman named Terry finally answered. She said the transfer was done by a joint account holder. My stomach sank. The only other person on that account was Daniel, my son. I couldn't speak. My mouth felt dry. When I finally managed to ask if it was really him, she typed for a moment and then, in a soft voice, said, "Yes, ma'am. Your son authorized it last Thursday." That meant 4 whole days had passed, and he hadn't even bothered to tell me. I hung up, shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice trying to text him. No answer. I called, straight to voicemail. I didn't want to believe it. Not my Daniel, not the boy I raised alone when his father walked out. Not the boy I worked double shifts for. The boy I tucked little notes into his lunch bag until he was almost grown. I sat at my kitchen table, gripping my coffee mug so hard my knuckles turned white. When he finally called back that night, I didn't yell. I just asked, "Why did you take my money?" He said it so casually, like he was talking about borrowing a sweater. "I needed capital, Mom. You weren't going to use it. I've got an opportunity that could change everything." I asked what he meant, and he started rambling about crypto nodes and some trading thing I couldn't even follow. I told him I needed that money. I'd been saving it to fix the roof, buy hearing aids, and finally get the dental work I'd been putting off for years. He actually laughed. "Come on, Mom," he said. "You live like a monk. You don't even use half the stuff you save for. Let me grow it into something real." I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told him it wasn't his choice to make. He just said, "Well, technically it was. It's a joint account." That's when I realized I wasn't talking to my son anymore. I was talking to someone who saw me as nothing but a wallet. Now that he'd emptied it, I was just a burden. When I told him he had no right, he said, "I'm not going to argue. I'm busy. We'll talk later." And he hung up before I could even say his name. I sat in that silent kitchen for a long time. Then I stood up, walked over to the medicine drawer, and counted how many pills I had left. 14 days of heart pills, 12 thyroid pills, no money for refills, no savings, nothing. I pulled out the folder with all my financial papers. I flipped through every page, hoping maybe there was another account I'd forgotten about, or a check I hadn't cashed. But there was nothing. 30 years of careful saving, wiped out in a single moment by the person I loved most. I put the papers away and tried to tell myself he'd come to his senses, that he'd send the money back once he realized what he'd done. But deep down, I knew better. He took it because he knew I wouldn't stop him, because he knew I loved him too much to believe he could ever hurt me like this. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't just the shock pressing down on my chest. It was the math running through my head over and over. I had about $800 left in checking from Social Security, and $120 on an old grocery gift card I'd been saving for Christmas dinner. Rent was due in 12 days. My medicine would run out even sooner. That night, I just lay there staring up at the ceiling fan, going over the numbers in my head like a gambler who already knew she'd lost. When morning came, I didn't even bother with breakfast. I took only half of my pills, hoping I could make them last a little longer if I was careful. I walked to the pharmacy, praying maybe I had one refill left, or that Medicare would cover part of the cost. But when the clerk checked the computer, he just shook his head like he was telling me it might rain. Your plan doesn't kick in for another 3 weeks. Ma'am, he said. I asked how much it would cost if I paid for it myself, and he typed a few things, then looked up and said, $381. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt so unreal, like some cruel joke. That afternoon, I heated up a can of ravioli and cut my pills into thirds this time. I tried calling Daniel again, not to beg, just to see if he'd help me pay for my medicine. I kept telling myself maybe he didn't understand how serious this was. Maybe if I explained that without my pills, my heart could start beating out of rhythm again. He'd snap out of whatever selfish trance he was in. When he finally answered, he sounded annoyed, like I was a telemarketer bothering him. What now? He said, flat and cold. My throat felt tight, but I swallowed and told him I needed help paying for my medication. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, look, I told you. I'm out of money too. My startup's burning through cash. I'm not your ATM. I told him I wasn't asking for a handout, just a little help until I could figure something out. That's when he said it, just like this. Your health isn't my problem, Mom. You're an adult. You made your choices. I stood there holding the phone, feeling like it had burned my hand. I didn't say another word. I just hung up. I walked back to my little kitchen and opened the cabinets. Half a box of saltines, a dented can of green beans, some old instant coffee. I thought about trying to sell my recliner on Facebook Marketplace, but I pictured myself straining to lift it when someone came to pick it up and decided I didn't have the strength. That night, I opened my pillbox and didn't take anything. My chest was already tight, maybe from stress, maybe from not having enough medicine in my system. I went to bed hungry, my stomach growling loud in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up dizzy. I got up to use the bathroom, but the hallway started spinning like a carnival ride. I reached for the wall but missed and crashed to the floor, scraping my arm on the corner of the hallway table. I lay there for a moment, out of breath, wondering if this was how people ended up alone on the floor for days. With the cat dish tipped over and the microwave clock blinking, I managed to pull myself up, clean the cut, and sit back down at the kitchen table, the same chair where I'd first seen my bank account empty. I looked around at the house I used to feel proud of. My curtains, the family pictures on the wall, the neat rows of soup cans I always stocked like they mattered. Now, all I felt was shame. I kept thinking, I raised a son who could leave me to rot like this. What kind of mother does that? I tried to tell myself maybe he wasn't evil, maybe life had twisted him somehow. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was his face when he said, "Your health isn't my problem." And in that moment, something inside me changed. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I stopped hoping he'd come back to help me. I realized I'd spent 74 years trying to keep everyone happy, trying to be useful and quiet, but I was done waiting around. If Daniel thought I was just going to disappear without a fight, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The next morning, I opened the windows to let some fresh air in. The house smelled stale, like old sheets and canned soup. The breeze made me feel even weaker, like my bones were tired of holding me up. I made instant coffee with the last of the powder no milk and sat at the table. This time, I wasn't counting money. I was counting things I could sell, trade, or pawn, anything. To buy my medicine, I didn't have any jewelry worth much, except my wedding ring. I hadn't taken it off since 1986, but now I slipped it off and held it in my hand. Inside, it still had the words engraved, "Always us." What a lie that turned out to be. I wrapped it in a tissue and tucked it into my purse. Then I dragged my old sewing machine out of the closet, the one I used to make Daniel's Halloween costumes when he was little and still wanted to be Batman or Buzz Lightyear. I stuffed it into a laundry bag. I called a cab with the last bit of credit left on my prepaid phone and told the driver to take me to the pawn shop on Jefferson. The place smelled like dust and lost hope. I handed over the ring first, trying not to look like it meant anything. The man behind the counter squinted at it like he was inspecting a dented hubcap. "I can give you 70, he said without emotion. I didn't argue. Then, I slid over the sewing machine. "This is vintage," I told him, hoping that word might matter. He shrugged. "Maybe to somebody's grandma. I'll do 25. $95 total." I took the cash, folded it carefully, and stuffed it into my bra because I didn't trust my purse anymore. And then I walked out the door. When I left the pawn shop, I saw a woman standing by the counter, trying to sell her big flat-screen TV. She started crying when the man offered her only $30. I didn't say anything. What could I say? This world doesn't care about your tears unless they end up in a viral video. I walked 2 blocks toward the pharmacy because I wanted to pick up my pills right away. But halfway there, the sidewalk started to tilt under my feet. It wasn't really moving, but it felt like it. My heart began thumping out of rhythm, like it was sending a signal for help. I stopped walking and leaned against a bus stop pole, trying to catch my breath. People walked past me as if I didn't exist. A teenage boy glanced at me, then looked away just as fast. I tried to keep going, but the sun felt too bright, like someone had turned up the brightness on the whole world. My knees gave out, and I fell against a bench, knocking over a man's coffee. He cursed under his breath but didn't even try to help. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't open my purse. Then, a young woman came over to me. She couldn't have been more than 25, wearing scrubs and carrying a sandwich bag. She asked if I was okay. I tried to say yes, but no words came out. She called 911 before I could stop her. 10 minutes later, an ambulance was loading me inside while I kept apologizing, over and over, even though no one seemed angry. At the hospital, they checked my heart and asked about my medication. I explained everything, though I didn't say Daniel's name. The doctors and nurses looked at me with that sad, gentle pity that tells you exactly what they're thinking without saying it. They kept me overnight to watch my heart. They offered to set me up with social services, but I told them I had someone I could call even though it was a lie. I just couldn't stand admitting that the only person I had left was the one who put me here. The next morning, they sent me home with a cab voucher and a little brochure about local food banks. I sat down on my couch, still wearing the hospital socks, and stared at that brochure like it was written in another language. I'd never been on this side before. I was always the woman who donated extra cans at the church drives, not the one who needed them. I thought about calling Daniel again, but just picturing him laughing when I asked for help made me feel sick to my stomach. I looked around my living room. There were pictures everywhere: his graduation photo, his 5th birthday, his college acceptance letter, all framed neatly on the walls. Suddenly, the whole place felt like a museum for someone I used to believe in. And that's when an idea came to me. If Daniel wanted to act like I was already dead to him, then maybe it was time I started planning like I was. But not the way he expected, not by giving up, not by disappearing. I'd play along, I'd smile and nod, I'd stay alive, and then I'd make sure that everything he thought he was going to get went to someone who actually cared whether I lived or died. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the hospital discharge papers, the pawn shop receipt, and that wrinkled food bank flyer. It hit me how little I mattered to the people I shared blood with and how much I seemed to matter to strangers who owed me nothing. Like the young woman in scrubs who knelt next to me on the sidewalk, or the nurse who sneaked me an extra pudding cup because she said I reminded her of her grandma. That's when I realized kindness doesn't come from DNA, it comes from the heart. And my son didn't have any left if he ever did. I opened the drawer where I kept my old will. It was still notarized, still crisp, still naming Daniel as my only beneficiary. I hadn't updated it since 2009, back when I believed he'd be the one holding my hand when my time came. Not the person who'd leave me to collapse on a bench and ignore my calls while I sold my wedding ring just to stay alive. I stared at that will and thought, no, this is not how I go out. Not with him winning. Not with him walking away richer after draining the life out of me. So I called the only person who had checked on me without ever being asked, my neighbor, Linda. She was the one who kept slipping Tupperware containers of lasagna and green beans into my fridge when she knew I wasn't eating. The one who once offered to help with my groceries and never brought it up again when I said no. She never pried, but she always seemed to know when I was too proud to ask for help. When she answered, I told her I needed a favor, something that involved secrets, trust, and maybe a little bit of revenge. And bless her heart, she didn't even blink. She just nodded and said, all right then, let's do it. By noon that day, Linda and I were in her old car, heading to a small law office she'd found through a friend at her church. The place was run by a woman named Cheryl. She looked like someone who'd been through 3 divorces and come out winning every time. When I sat down and told Cheryl everything, how Daniel drained my account, how he laughed when I asked for help, how he said my health wasn't his problem, she didn't look shocked. Her face stayed calm and serious, and she just nodded. Then she said, "You're going to need more than a will, honey. You're going to need a backup plan." For the next 2 hours, she patiently walked me through everything. We set up a new living trust, a power of attorney, a medical directive, and yes, a brand new will. This time, it named Linda as the executor and the only person who would inherit what I had left: my house, my car, the little life insurance policy, the furniture, and most important of all, my story. Because I made Cheryl promise that if something ever happened to me, Linda would tell my story. Not so people would feel sorry for me, but as a warning. Too many mothers trust sons who turn out to be leeches, wearing their baby pictures like masks to hide what they really are. When all the papers were signed, Cheryl suggested we record a video, just in case anyone ever tried to challenge it. So I sat in front of her webcam and told the whole truth in a steady voice, no tears, no shaking. I explained how I had given my son everything, how he stole from me, how he left me when I needed him most, and how I was making this choice freely, to give what little I had to someone who actually showed up when it mattered. When it was over, Linda drove me home. We didn't talk much. We just sat there in the driveway, the engine off, the quiet pressing around us. Finally, she looked at me and asked, "You sure you're ready for this?" I told her I wasn't sure about much anymore, except for one thing. The next time Daniel showed up, it would be on my terms, not his. The look she gave me wasn't pity or worry, it was respect. And that meant more than any apology I knew I'd never get. Because now, I had a plan, I had a secret, and I finally had the power to decide how this story would end. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was back in control. Just under 3 weeks later, I heard a knock at the door. Not a polite knock, a hard, heavy one that made my stomach twist before my brain could catch up. I opened the door, and there he was, Daniel. He had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and that same cocky grin he'd worn the day he graduated high school. But instead of feeling sad or angry, all I felt was something colder, pure disgust. Still, I kept my face calm. I'd pictured this moment too many times to mess it up now. I opened the screen door and asked, "What happened?" Like I didn't already know. He shrugged, acting like it was nothing, and said his startup lost its funding. The investors pulled out, and his apartment was temporarily unavailable, which was just a fancy way of saying he'd been kicked out. Then he said, "I just need a few days, Mom, to regroup." Every part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but instead, I stepped aside and let him in, because I needed him here under my roof if I was going to watch him fall apart from the inside. The second he walked past me, he didn't even glance at the framed photo of us from Disneyland hanging on the wall. He went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge like he still owned the place, and grabbed a soda Linda had left for me. He popped it open without asking, like nothing had changed. Like he hadn't destroyed everything. And in that moment, I knew for sure I'd done the right thing with the will. He wasn't here because he loved me. He was here because he'd run out of people to drain dry. I was his last stop. So, I told him he could stay 5 nights. No more. He flashed that same old smile and said, "Of course. Thanks, you're the best." And I just nodded, because this time, I knew exactly what he was, and I wasn't afraid anymore. It was like he couldn't help himself, like he'd been practicing this act for years. That night, while he snored in the spare room, I took out the little hidden camera Linda had given me. It looked just like a digital picture frame, but it had a motion sensor. I set it up on the mantel so it pointed right at the hallway and the living room. If Daniel was planning to sneak around, I wanted proof this time, not just my gut feeling. The next few days were exactly what I expected. He lounged around like he owned the place, took long showers, left wet towels in heaps on the floor, and borrowed my car without even asking. He was glued to his phone, always whispering into it in corners. Every evening, he'd ask me about the bills, about my health, about how my money was holding up. I kept my answers vague. I told him I was getting by. I didn't say a word about the new will, or about Linda, or about Cheryl, or the video I'd recorded that could bury him in court if he tried anything. I watched him start poking around, first in the kitchen drawers, then in the file cabinet in the hallway. He did it casually, like he was hunting for stamps. But I saw that little glint in his eyes, the same one he used to get when he was a kid, about to lie about stealing candy. On the 4th night, I caught him going through my bedroom. He thought I was asleep, but I didn't confront him. I just waited until morning, made him pancakes, and even asked if he wanted bacon. When he smiled and said, "You're the best," I smiled right back and thought, "Go ahead. Keep digging your own grave." That evening, I watched the footage from the hidden camera. There he was, holding the big envelope marked Final Will and Testament, updated. He flipped it open and read every word, his mouth hanging open like he was trying to burn the letters into his brain. When he was done, he didn't look shocked or sad. He looked furious. Pure, raw anger, like a spoiled prince finding out the castle was going to the maid instead of him. He slammed the folder shut, stuffed it back in the drawer, and pulled out his phone. He dialed fast and started muttering, "She's lost it. This has to be undone." I didn't need to hear the rest to know what he was planning. He'd try to twist things around, guilt me, maybe even threaten me, but none of it mattered anymore. I had everything: recordings, paperwork, the law, and most of all, the truth. What he didn't realize was that by coming back to my house, he'd handed me the last thing I needed: his downfall, dropped right at my door in a duffel bag full of dirty laundry and desperation. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. I asked if he wanted eggs or just toast. He said toast without looking up from his phone, tapping away like he was hunting for answers he'd never find. I noticed how he kept glancing toward the hallway drawer, trying not to be obvious. I knew exactly what he was thinking, because I'd watched that video twice the night before: him reading the will, calling that shady friend who claimed to know estate lawyers, whispering like he was plotting a hit job on my dignity. But while he thought I was the same old woman who cried when he forgot Mother's Day, I was already 5 steps ahead. After breakfast, I told him I needed a nap. I went to my room, but instead of lying down, I opened my laptop and pulled up the camera feed. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, I heard the floor creak. There he was on screen again, this time with a notepad. He started copying information from the trust documents, probably planning some kind of legal sneak attack. Then he took pictures, thinking he'd send them to one of his cronies to figure out how to undo it all. But he didn't know Cheryl had already told me everything was rock solid, every page witnessed, time-stamped, and stored in 3 different places. Even if he tried to fight it, my video testimony would crush any lie he told. And still, I didn't say a word. Letting him think he was clever was the only way he'd keep stepping deeper into the trap. That afternoon, he cornered me in the living room with this fake concern in his voice. He asked how I was feeling, if I'd thought about tidying up my finances while he was around. He offered to help me organize the paperwork. I played dumb. I smiled. I told him how nice that sounded, and deep down, I was already imagining the look on his face when he finally realized he'd lost everything he thought he deserved. I was too tired to think straight, so I told him I'd think about looking over the old documents with him, if he could be patient. He smiled at me like a snake that had just found an open window. "Of course, Mom," he said sweetly. "I just want to help." Then he went straight to the guest room and shut the door, probably to call whoever he thought could rescue his stolen future. By then, I wasn't even angry anymore, just disappointed. This wasn't just about greed. It was about having no shame, no conscience at all. That's when it really sank in. I hadn't lost a son. I'd just finally seen who he truly was. That night, I made a pot of chili and invited Linda over. I told her to act casual. We sat in the kitchen, laughing about old memories, while I could feel Daniel standing in the hallway, eavesdropping. At one point, I slipped in a little lie about needing to revisit that trust stuff soon, and I watched his body freeze like a statue. He thought maybe his phony kindness was starting to work. The next morning, he made his big move. He came into the kitchen holding a folder he'd printed at the library. He said he'd drafted a better version of my will, more streamlined, easier for me. He offered to take me to a notary later that week to sign it. I smiled and said, "Sure, I'll look it over." I took the folder and told him I'd need to compare it to the one I already had on file. The second he left the room, I slipped the folder into a plastic evidence sleeve, wrote the date on it, and tucked it into a hidden file labeled recipes. Because by now, this wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about making sure that when everything finally blew up, he wouldn't be able to wriggle out of the truth. No sob story, no spin, no excuses. Later that evening, I pulled up all the videos, audio recordings, photos, and that fake will he'd handed me. I backed it all up onto a flash drive, and Linda took it home in her purse, just in case anything ever happened to me. I remember sitting on the couch afterward with my hands folded, staring at the front door. I knew Daniel would come back in any minute, expecting me to break down, to cry, to admit I'd changed my will in some moment of confusion. And it hit me that he was too far gone to ever imagine I'd done all this on purpose, that I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was documenting everything, setting the stage for the kind of downfall you can't lawyer your way out of. Sure enough, he came back later and asked if I'd looked over the will. I smiled and said, "I'm thinking about it." The look in his eyes told me he still believed he was winning, and that was exactly what I needed him to think, just a little longer. The next morning started like any other, except now, everything Daniel did felt like a performance. He was acting out some play where he was still the golden son, offering to take out the trash or fix the porch light. As if doing a few chores could erase the months he ignored me, the money he stole, and the day he looked me in the face and said my health wasn't his problem. While he played handyman, I sat at the kitchen table watching the footage one more time. I watched him flip through my trust documents, whispering to himself, trying to memorize numbers he hadn't earned. And something in me finally, in a loud way, but quiet and final, like a lock clicking shut forever, I knew it was time to stop playing defense. It was time to let the truth out into the world. So I called Linda and asked her to come by around noon. When she arrived, I handed her the flash drive and said, "Don't ask questions. Just give this to your friend at the local advocate group, the one who handles elder abuse cases." She looked at me for a moment, searching my face for any sign of doubt. But when she didn't see any, she nodded and said, "You got it." Then she tucked the flash drive into her purse like it was something sacred. 2 days later, everything blew up. Linda's friend didn't just send the files up the chain, she showed them to a local reporter. The reporter ran an article online titled "Son Steals from Retired Nurse, Then Tries to Steal Her Will." They even included screenshots from my hidden camera. The story went viral in less than a day. It spread all over social media, faster than I ever imagined. There were hashtags I never thought would be attached to my name. Hashtag Elder Justice. Hashtag Not Your ATM. Hashtag Greedy Son. By the third day, the article had over 1 million views. People were leaving comments like, "She deserves everything back and more," and "Throw him in jail." Meanwhile, Daniel was still sitting in the guest room, completely clueless, thinking he was still working me. Then his phone buzzed. I knew the exact moment he saw the article, because he stormed into the kitchen, his face red, holding his phone out like it was something disgusting. He yelled, "What the hell is this?" I looked him right in the eye and said, "The truth." My voice was calm, like I was telling him the weather. He started shouting, saying I'd humiliated him, ruined his reputation, that he could lose clients, and all these big opportunities. I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze and said, "You already lost something more important. You lost your mother." For once, he had nothing to say back. He just stormed down the hall and slammed his door so hard a picture fell off the wall. The next day, news vans started parking across the street. Reporters kept calling the house, asking if I'd talk to them. I agreed to one interview not because I wanted attention, but because I knew so many other people like me were out there, mothers, fathers, grandparents, people being used and forgotten by their own children. Someone needed to say it out loud. So I sat on my front porch with a blanket over my knees, looked straight into the camera, and told the world everything. How I worked 30 years in hospitals, how I saved every penny, how I raised my son alone and trusted him with everything, and how he drained my life savings in one click and didn't even look back. When I told them how he said, "Your health isn't my problem," my voice cracked. But I didn't cry. I wanted people to see strength, not weakness. The segment aired that night. My face filled the screen. His was blurred next to words like accused and investigation pending. By the time Daniel saw it, he'd already lost 3 consulting jobs and gotten a call from the state licensing board. That's when it finally clicked for him. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about reputation, about consequences, about justice. He started pacing around the living room, yelling into his phone, throwing around words like lawsuit and slander. I just sat in my chair and watched, feeling a quiet satisfaction I can't even fully explain, because now, this story wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who'd ever been left behind by someone they loved. There was no undoing it, no deleting the videos, no silencing the millions of strangers who now knew exactly who he was. By the end of the week, Daniel wasn't just panicking, he was falling apart. He stomped around the house like a caged animal, mumbling into his phone, slamming drawers, disappearing for hours, then coming back with excuses about damage control. I could see it in his eyes, the way he wouldn't look at me and flinched. Every time his phone buzzed, he knew something worse was coming, and sure enough, it hit like a freight train. A plain envelope came in the mail addressed to him. He ripped it open at the kitchen table. I watched his face drain of color as he read the first few lines. It wasn't a bill, it wasn't a threat. It was a notice from the IRS. They were opening an investigation into undeclared earnings and suspicious business transactions tied to his so-called startup. I didn't say a word. I just sipped my tea while he stood there, blinking like a man who'd been shoved off a building and was only just realizing he couldn't fly. The next few days, it only got worse. One by one, all those investors he'd lied to about projected returns started calling, texting, even showing up at the house. I watched him lie to their faces, promising refunds he couldn't pay, blaming smear campaigns and media manipulation, like he was the victim of some big conspiracy, instead of a man finally paying for his choices. Then came the repo truck, big, red, loud. It pulled into the driveway like it belonged there. Two men got out and started loading up his leased Tesla. He ran outside, yelling, waving his arms. They didn't even look at him, just handed him the final notice and kept working. I stood at the window, watching while the car, his symbol of all that fake success, was driven away like it was nothing. He came back inside, shaking with rage. He pointed at me, voice cracking, and demanded that I fix it. Like somehow all of this was my fault. Like I was the reason his whole life was caving in. That's when I looked him in the eye, steady and calm, and told him, I'm not going to save you. No lawyer can erase the truth. Every lie you told has finally caught up to you. He just stood there staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and maybe he was. I realized I must have sounded like I was speaking a foreign language to him, because it never crossed Daniel's mind that I could have boundaries, that I could say no and mean it. 2 days later, an eviction notice showed up, not for my house, but for the apartment he'd abandoned. His landlord had finally figured out he wasn't coming back and wasn't paying the rent. Now, Daniel was officially homeless, jobless, under IRS review, and getting torn apart online by the same people who used to believe every word he said. And still, he didn't apologize. He didn't sit down across from me and say, I was wrong, I hurt you. Instead, he walked around like some storm victim who thought the sky owed him a refund. Linda, bless her, checked on me every single day. She brought groceries, helped me screen all the calls, and even set up a folder to keep track of any legal papers in case Daniel tried to pull something. Around that time, a local nonprofit reached out. They offered me legal support and a chance to share my story even further. I said yes. By then, it wasn't just about me. It was about every other person who'd ever watched someone they loved squirm under the weight of their own arrogance. Then one night, I woke up to loud knocking. I opened the door and there he was, Daniel, standing there with his duffel bag, eyes wild, voice shaky. Mom, please, you have to let me stay. Just for a little while. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had never once said thank you, never once given love without expecting something back, never once believed I was anything more than a backup plan. And I said no, Daniel, just that, no yelling, no tears, just a full stop. He stood there, stunned, like I'd punched the air out of his chest. I watched him walk down the steps with nowhere to go, no car, no money, no friends left to bail him out. And I didn't feel joy, exactly, but I felt peace. The kind of peace you only earn when you finally stand up to the one thing you always thought you couldn't live without. When he disappeared into the dark, I closed the door behind him. I locked it. Then I sat down and wrote one last update to my will, not because I needed to change anything, but because it felt good to remind myself that I still owned my life and everything that came next. The morning after I turned him away, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was worried or scared, but because something inside me had finally shifted. It felt like a heavy stone had rolled off my chest. I stood in my kitchen, making coffee in the quiet. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy, it felt peaceful. While the coffee brewed, I sat at the table, pulled out the final version of my will, and read it over one more time. Everything was right where it belonged. No loopholes, no back doors, no way for Daniel to twist it into something for himself. A few hours later, I heard the mail slot click. I picked up an envelope with Daniel's name on it, postmarked from the county legal office. Even though I didn't care about his problems anymore, I opened it on instinct. Inside was a notice about a civil lawsuit filed against him by 3 of his old investors. They were accusing him of fraud, lying, and stealing their money. I folded it back up, put it in another envelope, and wrote a little note that said, "Not at this address." Then I walked it right out to the mailbox and sent it back without another thought. That afternoon, Linda came over to help me box up old things I wanted to donate. We sat on the floor folding sweaters and sorting books. She looked at me and asked, "You okay?" I smiled and said, "I think I'm better than okay," and I meant it. That night, I pulled my little red suitcase out from the back of the closet, not because I was running away, because I was finally ready to leave the house I'd lived in for 43 years. The house that used to feel warm but now just felt like a museum full of memories I'd already made peace with. I called the senior living community I'd visited months ago, the one with the quiet garden, the art room, and the bingo nights that actually looked fun. I told them I was ready to move in. When they said they had an apartment available next week, I said, "I'll take it." I paid the deposit and hung up the phone, feeling lighter, like I'd finally dropped an anchor I didn't know I'd been carrying. On moving day, Linda came with me. She helped me carry the few framed photos I decided to keep me and her at the lake, my old dog Toby from 10 years ago, and just one of Daniel from when he was 5 and still believed I could do anything. I was magic to him once. That thought crossed my mind as we drove to my new home, the radio playing old Motown songs. We didn't say much on the ride, just let the music fill the space. When we pulled up, the staff greeted me by name and offered to carry my boxes, and that's when I realized starting over doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be steady and quiet and earned. 2 days later, a letter came with no return address, only my name in Daniel's handwriting. I opened it slowly, wondering if it would be a threat, an apology, or some last plea. All it said was, "I don't know how to fix this. I'm sorry, Daniel." I folded it once and tucked it into a drawer, unread beyond those words. I wasn't interested in rewriting anything anymore. A week later, I changed my phone number, updated all my accounts, and made one final trip back to the house. I handed the new keys to the realtor. Standing in the empty living room, I looked around one last time, not just saying goodbye to the house, but to the woman I used to be, the woman who begged for love, waited for calls that never came, who thought that forgiving someone was the same as surviving them. And when I closed the door, I didn't cry, I didn't look back. I just got in the car with Linda, rolled down the windows, and drove away. I knew Daniel had finally learned what it meant to lose not just money, but a mother who loved him, until he gave her no reason left to. 5 years passed like slow turning pages in a book I wasn't in a hurry to finish. In that time, I lived quietly and peacefully, surrounded by people who didn't want anything from me but my company, and maybe a partner for trivia night. Linda became more than a neighbor. She became my family, the kind you choose. We laughed, more than I ever thought possible at our age. Found joy in little things, a good blood pressure reading, a ripe peach from the market. I never once regretted my decision. Not the will, not the public story, not the day I closed the door for good. Every day that went by reminded me that walking away from Daniel was the first real act of self-respect I'd ever done. I never heard his voice again, though sometimes I'd see his name in articles about fraud cases, revoked business licenses, and civil judgments he couldn't pay. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the quiet knowledge that people rarely change unless they lose something they thought they owned forever. In my final year, when the doctor told me my heart meds weren't enough anymore, I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. I had said what needed to be said. I had given what needed giving, and I'd left nothing behind that wasn't exactly where I wanted it. When the time finally came, I slipped away in my sleep with Linda sitting beside me, holding my hand and humming one of the songs we used to play in the car. At my memorial, she stood in front of the small room. Friends, nurses, a couple of aides from the center, some community members who remembered my story. She held an envelope I'd left behind, marked, "Only if he shows up." And sure enough, Daniel did show up, late, alone, in a suit that didn't fit anymore. He stood in the back, quiet, maybe hoping for forgiveness, or maybe just wondering what crumbs I'd left him. Linda opened the letter and read it out loud. "Daniel, by the time you hear this, I'll be gone. Maybe that's the only reason you came. But I want you to understand something very clearly. I loved you with every cell of my body till you taught me not to. I gave you everything I had, and when I needed you most, you taught me the sharp edge of abandonment. You didn't just take money, you took trust, you took safety, you took pride, and still, I gave you chances. Not just once, but over and over, until it bled me dry. So this will, this house, this small legacy, none of it is yours. I gave it to someone who stayed, someone who fed me when I couldn't stand, someone who never asked for anything in return. That is love. That is family. And that is why this will stayed exactly as it was. When she finished, Linda folded the letter. Daniel didn't argue, he didn't cry, he didn't shout. He just turned around and walked out, his shoulders slumped. A man who finally understood what it meant to lose everything. Linda passed the envelope to the attorney to be filed away. Then she looked up at the small crowd and said that I'd gotten the last word just like I always planned. And in that room filled with soft smiles and warm eyes, my story didn't end in rage or revenge. It ended in resolution, in dignity, and in the quiet triumph of a woman who finally chose herself.